Welcome everyone to this webinar of the fall 2021 of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. Today, we are honored to have with us Richard Dictus, President of Amfori, to talk about trade with purpose. With the advent of sustainability thinking at the end of a previous century, corporate thinking about sustainable global supply chains has produced positive social, ecological, and climate outcomes has taken flight. Many larger multinational companies are strongly committed well beyond traditional CSR thinking and have invested in systems to establish compliance to various human rights, global labor, and other social standards originating from the OECD, UN, or EU. The thinking is best summarized as trade with purpose, making sure that retailers and intermediates proceed with the intent in their buying behavior as it impacts further down the supply chain. Climate change in particular is now challenging conventional wisdom in a major way, where countries like France, Germany, and Switzerland have put legislative and regulatory instruments in place for human rights and social performance. New EU legislation now also draws in climate impact. However, the standards and their implications are not so clear. And the webinar will explore this from a vantage point of a market-leading business association in human rights and social due diligence. What is the impact on trade relations? How can progress be made, and where do values converge? Or is this going to create yet another divergence between the northern and the southern hemisphere? It's a very pleasure to introduce Richard. Richard joined Amfori in June 2021 as president, based in the association head office in Brussels. Amfori brings together over 2,400 retailers, importers, brands, and associations from more than 40 countries. Its memberships contain organizations of all sizes and all sectors with a combined turnover of more than 1 trillion euros. These members have the power to change the world. Amfori enables them to do that by driving environmental, social, and trade improvements in the supply chains. Until January 2021, Richard has been the UN resident coordinator in Egypt. He undertook the functions of UN humanitarian coordinator, resident coordinator in Baghdad, Iraq. From May to August 2020, in Baghdad, he faced immediate challenge of managing a humanitarian response plan with the new interim government, seized with the triple security, economic, and COVID crisis. Richard Dictus also is on the advisory board of the Gerhard Center, and it's a great pleasure to have him with us. Richard, the floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you very much, Ali, for that introduction. So the last time that I spoke on this forum, I was just stopped my career with the United Nations, where I had worked 33 years, looking at the issue of sustainable development very much from a public sector lens. How are governments going to achieve the sustainable development goals? But gradually during my career in the latter years, I became increasingly more aware of the fact that one of the major actors in the entire sustainability sphere, the private sector, the corporate world, really had only a very limited voice in the sustainability debate. And that when we were talking about the goals that deal with sustainable production and sustainable consumption, that there were many misconceptions amongst the public sector actors about really what the private sector and what the corporate world can deliver. So when I got an opportunity to become an interim manager at the Amfori Foundation, this is a business association which basically has has members most of the big brand names. You will find Amazon here, you will find CNA here, you will find Hennes & Mauritz, I mean, really big global brand names that have actually come together and said, okay, we want to do more about sustainability. We want to do more about making life better for our workers, for our stakeholders, for our shareholders, who are all members of the same community. But we want to do it in a business-like fashion. It means that all of the solutions that Amfori is working on all the sustainability solutions are based on a business-to-business concept. That businesses who know will help other businesses who do not yet know. And that businesses who have big investment strategies will help other businesses who don't really have the capability of making such big investments. And generically, over time, this should uplift the entire global supply chain that these organizations represent, these very big multinationals, but also some smaller organizations, will uplift them to a greater level of sustainability. So what I'm going to talk about is actually issues that I have learned in the last 3 months as I was managing here. I specifically went looking for this knowledge, and I'm quite fascinated with some of the things that I've seen. So I'm going to provoke you. I'm going to make a couple of very bold statements, and I'm going to try and bring them down to at the end to something that actually shows how much new thinking is required if we truly see the corporate sector as a major actor in the sustainability atmosphere, as a major actor that can shape the world. It's not all up to governments. Now, my first provocative statement is that I actually think that trade liberalization is walking on its last legs. So for many years in development, we grew up with different trade agreements that were in the 1980s used in the context of the Cold War, trying to get political access, trying to manage alignment, to in the 1990s slowly shifting more towards specific positions. You had a multi-fiber agreement managed by the European Union that was very specifically about giving preferential access to least developed countries to the European market at a preferential rate so that they could actually benefit and grow economically more. There were many different ways in which access to markets and flow of goods from one market to the other were regulated. And you can also now see that this is coming to an end because of the climate change debate. Because the climate change debate is really a major disruptor in here. Why is that? Well, because the same tools that were used to regulate market access for specific groups of countries or for specific political reasons may not necessarily be the tools to which you can regulate access on the basis of climate change performance of producers in other countries. Now, let me start off with saying a second provocative statement, and that is the so-called consumer paradox. As the middle classes in the world are growing, you have more people who want to consume more. What do they want to consume? More people want to have a car. More people want to eat a lot of meat. More people want to buy more clothes. Now, that in itself inherently means that the combination of economic growth and population growth will increase automatically the global carbon footprint with all the consequences that we know that that has. Now, the counter move to that is talking about certain consumers who are looking for sustainable products that have a good carbon footprint, recyclables, circular economy models, but also products whereby we know that nobody has been exploited, that there is no forced labor, that women are treated equally and fairly in the workplace, etc., etc., etc. All these things these consumers want. These consumers in California and in New York and in the Netherlands and in Germany and in Sweden. But all these consumers also have something in common, and that is that they don't want to pay anything extra for that. And that actually means that this consumer paradox is offloaded on the corporate sector. They have to resolve this. They need to find more products, better products, sustainable products at a lower price, and preferably in very, very big quantities. And that's when power games get into play. If you are a very large retailer like Amazon, you basically have the power to demand that the cost of these sustainable products are offloaded on the producers, particularly when the majority of these producers are actually in what I would term for in order to make it easy, the southern hemisphere. 95% of the retail goods in Europe are being sourced from either China, India, Bangladesh, or Vietnam. And that's 95%. And that means that essentially these very big retail giants can go back to the producers and say, well, look, these are the specifications of the product, these are the quantities that we want to have it, and more or less get into a position where they can dictate the price. Now, that may sound very, very strange, but we're talking about such volumes that indeed a lot of companies will go in at break even in order to get market access. Now, the more that we want to have our cake and eat it, and the more people want to have more cake, the more problem, the bigger problem this becomes. And at the time where we were conceptualizing the Sustainable Development Goals, we really didn't realize that. We didn't realize this growing problem, because the starting point had always been that governments had always been regulating their market access and were always working on issues of market imperfection. Give an example, governments in Europe regulated the price of alcohol and tobacco in order to put down the consumption of alcohol and tobacco, because these were health problems. These created many additional costs. And the tariffs that were put on certain things and the taxes that were put on certain things. At this moment, for instance, there is the idea that we should be driving a lot less in Europe because we indeed have a carbon problem. You can only solve that if you start driving less. So the way that governments now regulate that is to actually put more taxes on it. As they do this, they actually are beginning to find out that people continue to drive and want to drive, that actually the demand for certain products is relatively inelastic. So what they then consider the true cost of petrol or the true cost of cigarettes. The true cost of cigarettes takes into consideration the health cost of it. The true cost of petrol takes into consideration the carbon problems that this creates. Well, this does not mean that people after a certain moment start basically doing things in a different way. But also, these high consumer prices in Europe for certain products make it very difficult for the producers who basically want to maximize their product, maximize their market access, because they have stakeholders and shareholders within their own companies who want to be wealthy and who want to make money. So in order for these producers in this kind of market behavior to maintain volume and to maintain profitability, they have to cut costs and corners. And that actually means that rather than having these producers produce in a more sustainable manner, you actually will have a significant number of producers that will try to see if they can get away with not getting in there. Now, this really challenges governments because historically, legislative and regulatory measures managing market access and trade negotiations were a way in which you could actually push a different kind of behavior. Now, governments are challenged in two different ways with this. The first one is they notice that the behavior and the buying behavior of the consumers in Europe is not necessarily changing that much, even when they change the prices. So the internal regulation doesn't have the effect that they're looking for. And externally, they're actually caught in a bind. Because on the one hand, if you want to lower the carbon footprint of a particular country, then it's very attractive to offload carbon production to other countries. I'll give you an example. My own country, the Netherlands, we produce a lot of meat. We produce probably 5 times per capita the amount of meat that we would consume. That means that everything is exported. That means that the Netherlands takes the carbon footprint of that production. The produce is sent to Germany, and Germany therefore sort of imports the carbon without the carbon actually ever having been counted as their carbon or their emission. Now you can take that also towards other countries, whereby you have a particular product that is very polluting. You will make sure that that no longer is produced in your own country because that gives you a good ecological benefit, a good visibility, but you still need the product, so you're outsourcing the production to another country. Many countries have played this for a very long period of time, and now they're getting into the problem that very slowly the population and the politics are beginning to push back because they're saying, look, carbon, climate change, it's a global problem. And offloading carbon production to other countries so that you actually as a country look good in the carbon production sense makes no sense because you've just shifted the problem somewhere else. And that means that governments now have to start taking a look at legislating what happens in a supply chain. So this issue of legislating what is in a supply chain is something that has been practiced for a very long period of time, but for a different reason. So let's keep this thought here now, that governments would like to now try and see how they can compel retailers and buyers who buy products in other countries to only buy sustainable products that have a positive climate change impact in order to manage the total climate impact of a particular population. The tool that they are choosing for this is a tool that was actually developed for a different purpose. It was developed as a tool for human rights and social due diligence. What is this founded on? Well, if you actually look at the Human Rights Declaration, you will find that in there are many prescriptions concerning a proper behavior of employers towards employees. My favorite one, and you can check this, is Article 23B. I used my Article 23B once and had a supervisor who refused to actually give me any leave, despite the fact that I had a compelling family reason to be with my wife. These things happen in everybody's life. It's called having babies. And my boss refused to give me leave, and I then pulled out the charter and I showed him Article 23B. Human rights have a lot to do with employer behavior, whether you're talking about leave, equality amongst women, equality and gender equality in the way that employers proceed, or more excesses like forced labor. These things have been around for a very long period of time. And when gradually, at the end of the last century, the thinking around social impact and improving the performance of business and the visibility of business and the reputation of business came up, many companies really wanted to have a certification that the places where they bought their products, the companies that they brought their products, that they were treating their people well, that there were no human rights abuses in there, no child labor, no forced labor, gender equality, decent wages being paid, etc., etc., etc. In order to do that from a business perspective, you're not going to ask, are you doing this? No, you set up a mechanism that certifies that it actually is being done, and it's called social compliance auditing. Social compliance auditing was actually one of the market advantages that Untitled created for itself. It was one of the organizations that did this first, set up a global system with 13 audit firms, and that includes Deloitte, KPMG. You take all the big names that are involved in this. And there's now even a global organization that deals with the interests of social compliance auditors and makes sure that social compliance auditors are there. Now, this social compliance audit is being undertaken from a very clear perspective. These are the standards that have been developed by the United Nations, by the ILO, by the OECD, and to some extent some national standards that have been going on. In other words, there's a clear agreed way in which you go about measuring certain things and reporting about certain things. There's also an agreement here that if today you are not necessarily strictly meeting the human rights due diligence standards, there are certain red lines. Child labor is a red line, forced labor is a red line. When any of our members see a company or are receive reports about a company that actually is engaged in these kind of practices, automatically they will stop their business relationship with them. But then there can be issues around fair wages, there can be issues about overtime payments and leaves and things like that, where they actually will say, well, if we can't solve it now, we're coming back again in 4 years' time, we'll do another audit. By that time, you should have solved it. We will provide you from Untitled at that moment with support, training courses. We have an online academy that will help both producers and our members here in Europe on how to set up these processes so that there's a process of continuous improvement. So you have capacity development support followed up by regular audits that increasingly will show that there is an improvement in the human rights performance. Now you can understand that this principle of having an objective measurement taken by audit firms that really go to the companies that look at the whole issues is very appealing if you want to try and legislate the climate performance of a particular value chain that ends up in your country, be it Germany or being the Netherlands. But it's not so easy. let me give you a couple of examples. The first one is what we found out in human rights due diligence, which is called the multi-tier process. So big retailer in Europe will want to buy socks. They will go to a procurement company that has a global capability of procuring socks, because a retailer does not necessarily have a corporate competency in buying socks. This retailer will subsequently look at the companies that are producing the best quality, lowest price socks. But a sock is a component product. In other words, somewhere cotton is being grown, somewhere elastic materials are being made, somewhere yarn is spun, somewhere socks are being made, who are then subsequently packaged and transported. Now, the retailer in Europe cannot see how the cotton is being grown. And it therefore needs to trust that at every step of the way, the same due diligence with human rights and social performance are being applied, because otherwise you could still have a situation of, let's say, forced labor in a cotton supply or child labor in a cotton supply, which you absolutely don't want to have. This is a really, really big problem, because some products are so, let's take again the garment industry, where you will have wool, cotton, silk, the buttons, the yarn, the zippers, you name it. All of these come from different places, and all of them are being put together. So it's not so easy to say, well, we have a process of auditing, and everybody will adhere to this process of auditing, because that in itself then becomes extremely expensive. And particularly now that the issue is not just an issue of looking at social performance, but also looking at ecological performance. Another complication is that actually not one sector is the same. The garment sector has its challenges, but so does the mineral extraction sector. So does the food sector. The food sector is particularly complex. So all of these due diligence processes, and if you have to follow them all in order to certify at the end of this, or at least provide a reasonable assurance at the end of it, that these products have been produced without human rights problems and at a good climatological standard, it's complex, it's expensive, and it will push the bottom line even further down. So this is really complex. And the legislators are not looking at this complexity. They're basically saying that if a company that employs itself more than 250 people in Germany cannot certify and cannot provide evidence that it has monitored the human rights and ecological performance of its products, it will be penalized in the way that it does business. This is difficult. This is something that we really cannot figure out what that repercussion will be and how far this will drive business in Europe, at least, to offload the cost of this entire product, of this entire process, on the producers in the Southern Hemisphere in order to keep the sales prices down and their profit margins on. If you are now sitting in the Southern Hemisphere and you're looking at this development in the Northern Hemisphere, you really wonder what happens to mercantile advantages, what happens to the way in which you are supposed to produce and gain market access. There are so many more conditions that have to be met and systems that need to be fulfilled that the question becomes, how easy is it to have access to the European market? How easy is it to access? Now, when we start taking a look at how it now feels on the side of the producers, first of all, the producers in any country have an ethical dilemma. The ethical dilemma is this: that their businesses are not just there to create wealth for their shareholders, but they also have people who work for them. And it also has to create wealth for the people who work for them. Not only that, their shareholders and their employees are all part and parcel of the same society. Therefore, for these employers to try and get market access at the expense of climate or ecological performance is actually counterintuitive. Because you are polluting the environment that you live in. You are polluting the environment that your employees are living in. You're polluting the environment that your shareholders are living in. Now, interestingly, when you look at the larger companies, and that is also in Egypt as well as everywhere else, they have already long since realized that this is not the right way to proceed. I remember very well when Martin Polman, the then chairman of Unilever, outlined very clearly that it cannot be a business objective of Unilever to market products that are slowly killing off their clients. That is not the long-term business strategy. So most multinational companies, most larger companies, and again also larger Egyptian multinational companies, will have really good strategies on how to deal with this ethical dilemma. It is when you go further down the value chain, down the supply chain, further down the value chain, when you get to the smaller companies, where there is actually a question of whether the new news about ethical correct behavior, about ecological correct behavior, about climate change behavior, whether that actually has reached there. In as much as companies like Shell and Unilever and Exxon are talking about circular economic models that will be applied in the future, it's very questionable whether we actually have the knowledge to talk to small and medium enterprises about the same type of topics. Is there anywhere a place where that information about circular economy for small and medium enterprises can even be obtained? How would you set up a business strategy along those lines? So what we actually see in terms of compliance with new human rights or ecological standards is most of the time either a lack of knowledge. We don't know how this is being done. We don't know why this is an issue. Or quite simply, they don't have access to the information. And even if they would want to, they wouldn't know how to go about it. Well, that is one of those things where Amfori actually gets in. And I'll give you a nice example of how these relationships work. There is a small company in the Netherlands that is a third generation company. So it was the grandfather, the father, and now the sons are running this company. And they make duvets. And in order to make the duvets, they source the down, the goose feathers and the duck feathers in the Netherlands. There's not a problem with that. But the covers in which the goose feathers are put are actually sourced from China. So the young group that came in, they're now about 35, 40 years old. They wanted to really now make sure that they could market their product as an ecologically correct product. So they got into recycling the goose feathers and the duck feathers. And then they found out that actually they had no idea about the carbon footprint of the way in which the covers, the cotton covers, were being produced. So they packed themselves into an airplane, flew to China, visited all of their factories, and came back to their nice middle-class existence in the middle of the Netherlands. And they were a little bit shocked. And a discussion happened between the father and the sons, whereby the sons essentially said, Papa, our supply chain, the guys in China, these people in these factories are making no money. It's like we're looking back in the 1950s in our own history. It is terrible. We should do something that these people are also making more money. And the father sort of went like, look, I've always sourced my cotton from there. What is the problem now? Well, in as much as in the factory in the Netherlands, the father had fought for the well-being and the social protection of his employees, the sons were now beginning to make that same argument towards the Chinese employers. So they got to the Chinese employers and they started explaining this, and the Chinese said, we're very willing to do this, but what is our problem? So they called in Amfori commissioned an audit with them, and the audit indicated that one of the employers particularly had a problem with the way that overtime was being made. So there was too much overtime. People actually no longer could get home. Yes, they were making good money, but it got to the stage where really it was affecting people's health. So the two Dutch gentlemen, young gentlemen in their 40s, said to the slightly older Chinese factory manager, why don't you stop doing that? And the factory owner turned around and said, so why don't you stop asking for the delivery time all at the same time? All your European companies all want to have your goods delivered 2 weeks before Christmas. So if that's the way that this thing is structured, then there's no other way for me but to actually have a lot of overtime in September, October, November in order to reach my annual production. And the most important measure that these companies could now do, the partnership that they established in order to get a better social outcome, was to actually spread the orders and the payments for the orders throughout the year. And these two Dutch young men contacted all of the other buyers from the same company and made sure that everybody coordinated the time in which the orders were being made. Now, that is what we call continuous improvement. This is where, quite interestingly, the European company thought that there was a business mistake being made in the Chinese company, but actually what turned out was that the business mistake was theirs. They were not practicing what we would call responsible purchasing. So this process of continuous improvement and business relationships, whereby everybody in the value chain, everybody in the supply chain starts taking responsibility for the outcome, and where we don't automatically presume that if there's a problem, it's on the producer side, but actually that a lot of it has to do with the behavior of the retailer or the intermediary. This really is now the new frontier. And that means that in many respects, the original audit function, which was a quick way of measuring what was happening in a particular supply chain, is becoming a little bit less important. The whole process also nowadays is much more data-driven. In other words, if you have mapped a global supply chain and you've conducted 100 audits in those global supply chains, that actually gives you enough data in order to predict what behaviors will be in that supply chain. It will also give you enough material to predict where the pain points will be, where are the negative behaviors, which are the most polluting steps of your global supply chain. And what you will then see is that over time, a new risk management approach comes out, whereby, dependent on what the European legislator will do, that issue of risk and data will be redefined. The assumption here is that everybody is pursuing the same outcome. The same outcome is a life of dignity, prosperity for all, that everybody wants to consume as much as they possibly can, and that if you actually have good commercial relationships and you work within those commercial relationships to solve the sustainability problems, everybody essentially will profit. The problem now is that on that business relationship, the legislators are moving in. And when the legislators move in, they don't really look at the value chains and the supply chains and the way that they are set up and who makes what money. They essentially look just at the end outcome. Will the product, hello Marwa, welcome, good to hear you. Where the products that have been that reach the market, do they meet the European standards? If they meet the European standards, then the legislator is happy. How those standards are being met, what the prices are and the consequences, they don't really look at. Now, the consequence may be that there are certain economies that cannot meet these standards of access to the European market. These economies will most likely be least developed countries. And it actually means that European market access and North American market access will be reserved for relatively sophisticated economies. So it will not be for Malawi that will not be able to invest in the production capabilities that are required for that market access, but a country like Egypt that has the capability to invest, that has the trade infrastructure, that has the transport infrastructure, that has the educated people, that has an inherent capacity to invest, will be able to look at this and get access. So these measures that we're talking about now, this entire system, will that drive more equity in the world? No, it most likely won't. It will actually lead to a negative impact on the least developed countries that not only will have more difficulties to get market access, but that also will actually see that the products that they will have access to will have a very negative carbon or ecological footprint. They will be able to only choose from those producers that actually did not cut the grade for Europe. The regulation, therefore, is actually more or less falsifying the economic outcome. So let me try to see if I have provoked you enough by sort of concluding on the issues that I think we should ponder on. First, legislation and regulations. Trade relationships or trade agreements that worked in the past to regulate trade access for either economic or political gain, are they really good tools to try in the future to manage climate change? internal market regulations by Northern European countries in the United States that they've used for cigarettes, alcohol, and petrol. Will those same tools also work to come up with a new price equation for carbon-heavy products and for the way that products will have been done? And if they do that, is that something that then is manageable? Because it basically means that the legislator will have to look at every product that comes on the market and tries to come up with a correction, which is regression ad infinitum, which can hardly work. Trade agreements cannot really work in the way that they used to work anymore, because if you really start setting climate change criteria for access to markets, as I outlined at the end, it most likely will mean that a larger number of countries that do not have the capability to invest in meeting these criteria will be excluded from market access to the wealthiest and most profitable markets in the world. And that will basically start driving another wedge between the global south and the global north. Finally, due diligence for climate change. Can that really work? For human rights and for social due diligence, there were clear OECD, ILO, UN standards. Those same standards do not yet exist for climate, and therefore you can't really audit for climate yet unless there is more or less a much stronger agreement. Underneath there is the consumer paradox. Everybody wants to consume more, pay less, and have ecologically sound products, but ecologically sound products inherently cost more money. We also have the tendency of a number of countries to try and outsource carbon-intensive production so that actually their scorecard in carbon neutrality or climate neutrality goes up fairly rapidly. But on the global level, nothing actually changes because the only thing that they've done is shifted production. And then finally, how in this situation will we get to real climate standards? Einstein, as some of you who know me know that Einstein is one of my favorite philosophers, although he did many other things also. But he basically said, problems cannot be solved with the same thinking that gave rise to the problems in the first place. As climate change is largely man-made, our current level of economic thinking inherently will lead to the outcome that we currently are going into. More people want to consume more and therefore will have a higher climate impact. We need new thinking and we need it rapidly. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Richard. It's a very rich talk. I have few comments, few observations. Remember when you first took your job with Amphori, I've told you that we were discussing it, and I was telling you that companies usually, when they hide their foul play, they don't hide it in first or second tier. Sometimes they have multi-tiers between them and the violation. Now, the issue is, how do you audit? How do you go through across all of this? I used to work with the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Only entity that I've seen that does a good job in this type of a thing was the Department of Homeland Security, the US Custom, basically. And they were doing it to verify rules of origin. The things were not submarined from China into Egypt and then exported under a trade agreement. But when you talk about human violations, it's rarely the case. You just make sure that you can comply, and then but your comment was very interesting, and I'm still not 100% believing in it. You said that most companies are not interested in burying their foul play down in the value chain because eventually it will blow up in their face. So that's my first comment to you. And do you think really companies, at large, not the few good ones or the average good ones, it only takes few violations, it only takes a critical mass, it doesn't need the majority. Would they really comply without really having strong civil society that watches them, without really strong rules, regulations, enforcement, and audit, given that it's really hard to audit?
No, look, it's very clear that an empowered civil society pushing this agenda is what actually is essentially shifting the tolerance within business for non-compliance, right? So the fact that there is now in Germany a recent court case where a number of our members were taken to court by civil society concerning certain supply chains where there was an idea that there could have been forced labor in those supply chains. And these civil society organizations were trying to force these companies to really look down their supply chain to see if there was any possibility of foul play, as you call it. That immediately goes as a total shockwave through the entire business community, and they don't really like that. They really European businesses basically know that if you remember the story of Nestle in the 1960s, where they came up with a product that actually was baby milk that killed babies rather than made them survive, because they hadn't figured out that in the third world people were not boiling the water for the baby milk. That still pursues Nestle today. So the issue of reputational damage is something that really drives them. Big companies here that get problems around animal rights issues within Europe most definitely have no appetite for getting caught in forced labor issues in another country. Now, the reason why they are very, very vigilant about what is being hidden in their supply chain is essentially the advent of real data, big data. There is so much known about what happens in supply chains nowadays. Data is being collected, it's historically being collected. That means that at this moment, if you don't really look at it, 4 or 5 years down the line, all of a sudden, data-driven processes will indicate where the pain points in your particular supply chain could be, and you could actually then retroactively get a problem. So, but again, it's the larger companies. The larger companies are driven by this. They have no appetite for this risk. They don't really want to have anything, but they can sometimes offload the risk or outsource the risk to an intermediate. And then, of course, is now the next layer that civil society in Europe is going after, is asking questions concerning those intermediates. So if you are a large retail company, let's say Carrefour, you have Carrefour in Egypt also. Carrefour is a huge company here. Carrefour really does not want to get into any reputational issues over here on the issue of what it does with other ones. And they therefore will have their socks ordered by some small company in Germany. And then that small company in Germany has to take care of everything that happens in the value chain. If they get caught out in that value chain or in that supply chain with not having the right product, then Carrefour can say, well, look, we outsource the risk management of this to the small company. They're pushing the risk management further down, and ultimately the risk management will be pushed down to, let's say, if you're looking at the Egyptian market, they will find intermediates in the Egyptian markets who will become their risk management tool for these kind of issues. It's no longer compliance, but risk management. It's no longer audit-driven, but data-driven. And it's no longer invisible. These things, particularly on climate, they're very visible.
Okay, I'm going to follow what you said. There is an interesting Dutch company, chocolate company, called Tony's Choco Lonely.
Yes.
This was a company, I mean, actually, there was a Netflix documentary a few years back. It was called Rotten. And this specific documentary was called Bitter Chocolate. And this company was actually shown as an exemplary of, quote unquote, an ethical chocolate, meaning that they don't condone slavery, modern day slavery. Now, the interesting thing, this company was actually removed from the ethical chocolate list at the start of the year because they were dealing with a huge Belgian chocolate sourcing company called Barry Callebaut. Callebaut is like Cargill. I mean, this is the interesting thing, that most of, I mean, especially in agriculture, most of the major sourcing companies, they don't mind violations, and they know how to hide it. So this is one comment. So the other thing is that when you look at the UN Global Compact, it says explicitly when it comes to human rights, you cannot be directly involved and you cannot be complicit. I cannot hire somebody to do my killing. I'm still liable for it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I did not transfer the risk to him. I'm still a criminal. sort of say. I mean, I might be a little bit exaggerating, but you can think about it this way. So I just wanted to hear your comment, and then I'm going to switch and start taking questions from the audience.
Look, the human rights issues and human rights violations are agonizing for companies now, because the legislators in Europe, there's new European legislation coming out within the next 6 months. The German legislation is already there, Swedish legislation, Danish legislation, French legislation, Dutch legislation, all of them essentially making, really coming out with sanctions against companies that do not have their human rights risk management in place. And this risk management needs to be multi-tier, and this risk management needs to be multi-sectoral if they are multi-sectoral themselves. The issue now for these companies is essentially an issue of cost. What's the cheapest way that they can get their due diligence sorted so that they have what I would call, in between parentheses, plausible deniability? Now, many smaller companies and medium-sized companies simply are now beholden to these big suppliers, and therefore they're trying to manage this risk on their behalf. They are trying to make sure that these systems are being put in place. And everybody is now waiting for one of these human rights cases to be taken to court to see exactly what the implications are. I'll give you I gave you an example already of a number of our members having been taken to court on the issue of forced labor. But before that, in the Netherlands, a court case was won against Shell in terms of their ecological performance across the globe. And that was the very first time that a company like Shell was actually held accountable in a court of law, not for what they did in the Netherlands, but for what they did across the entire world. So that means that that legislation border is shifting. It's becoming more stringent. It's becoming more global in its thinking. It's becoming more sophisticated. And companies basically say, well, if this is what the legislator wants, is the legislator prepared to pay for it? Who pays the bill for all of these things? That's the thing that they're coming back in on. And yeah, the consumer, as I say, doesn't really want to pay for it. The legislator doesn't really want to pay for it by giving, let's say, tax breaks to companies that have good performance. The consequence of that is that they essentially are now legislating without intending to, but with the net result that more companies are going to try and find ways of outsourcing the risk to the level where the violation can simply no longer be spotted. In other words, cutting corners is going to be an implication of the way in which certain legislators are going to go about it if we do not come up with smart new thinking and if we do not come up with smart new tools. And that's where my emphasis on data, risk management associated with data, understanding better more where the pain points are, and working on a business-to-business relationship in order to mitigate this, and the patience from the legislator that Rome wasn't built on a day. Yeah, they have to wait for countries to catch up.
Okay. I'm ready to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and don't let me monopolize the discussion with Richard here. Okay, Vinay, please unmute yourself. Vinay, please unmute yourself.
Yes, it was a great discussion on sustainability, Richard. So my basic question was that regarding this issue of the green technology and the concern regarding the digitization also. So how do you make this work? Because as far as the regulations are concerned and as far as the compliance is concerned, the governments and everyone is concerned about the product itself. But there's a lot of exploitation going on in the back end. In case if you look at for example in the General Motors car or a Ford car, as in as compared to which is being sold today, is going through, a number of stages of manufacturing process, and going through at least 10 countries, to ultimately to the final consumer. And although it meets the, safety standards, everything, as far as the quality is concerned, but we don't know about the, the exploitation that is going on in the back end, regarding as far as the labor is concerned, as far as the, the environment is concerned, simply because, the lot of these manufacturing processes are automated, and either they are in the informal countries, for example, in the developing countries, where there's not that sort of awareness and the compliance as far as the labor is concerned. So do you think that will be a challenge as far as future is concerned, because the automation is going to go big, and we are now going to be using smartphones and technologies which are going to be a lot more complex, for example, silicon chips, semiconductors, etc., which are going to be produced in a number of stages, and then number of complicated countries also, complex countries where these standards are very, very non-existent at this point of time. So there will be two worlds where the product is going to be matching certain standard, high level standard, but the compliance, but it is coming at the cost of environment, labor, and the entire manufacturing process, etc. So how can one gain digitization, etc., digitization and digitization and or such type of things, because as far as the Panama Papers are concerned, it opened the Pandora Papers, you will find that there are a lot of tax evasions by these big corporates, etc., but and the investment in sustainability is simply greenwashing. So how can one achieve that goal? So simply wanted to have some sort of insights from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vinny. You've raised a number of issues at the same time, so let me try and see if I can unpack them. The first issue is about, how do you deal with exploitation when it's difficult to pinpoint where exactly the exploitation is taking place? Because exploitation in many situations, people will try to hide it, companies will try to hide it, because it could be affecting the way in which they can get export orders. Now, here we make a differentiation between the known unknowns, in other words, the things that we know that we don't know, and the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know that we don't know. Now, that last category, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. When there are things happening in locations that are not visible, where you can't get access, where you can't talk to people, where you cannot set up grievances and whistleblower mechanisms so that actually exploited laborers can actually go and raise a complaint. In places like that, you have too many unknown unknowns, and most likely that will mean that companies will stop investing in those locations as places where they will source from. Then you have another situation, which is where you are dealing with known unknowns. In other words, you've made an analysis of what can happen in a particular supply chain based on the historic data that you have. You engage with your producers in the supply chain in order to minimize the risks that you have identified and make sure that they adopt appropriate behavior. That seems to be the way in which digitalization, audit compliance, as well as good data management and big data are most likely going to drive the agenda too. But again, it would mean that sourcing countries will predominantly be countries that have a certain level of sophistication where you can do business in this particular way. And that is my entire argument why I do believe that the current movement will make it more difficult for least developed countries to get market access and for least developed countries to get access to the benefits of this growth. However, in as much as there is automation, as you correctly pointed out, and in automated situations and well-run sophisticated factories, the level of abuse will not only be easy to measure, but probably is not going to be there, because underpaid people tend to make havoc out of very expensive equipment. So you want to pay your people well, you want to treat them well, they're sitting on major investments for you. But we now see that there's a shift of certain production processes out of China In first line, they went to Sri Lanka. When 10 years ago, Sri Lanka became too expensive, they moved into Ethiopia. Now Ethiopia is having problems. They're moving to Madagascar, Mauritius, South Africa, and even places like Zambia and Malawi. The point is that there is a certain part of our current economic enterprise across the globe that will always gravitate to the places where there are lots of vulnerable people that actually will pay for or will work for next to nothing, and that have a high tolerance for this kind of abuse. As long as this kind of vulnerability exists, the kind of inequity in the power relationships, we are going to see abuses everywhere, and the abuses are global. I remember a discussion that we had inside our membership about forced labor, and it was very clear. Forced labor, you don't really want to see what happens in the Italian or Spanish wine sectors, or in the Romanian or Bulgarian wine sectors, in relationship to the Latin American wine sectors and the South African wine sectors. There are difficult working relationships there because manual labor is needed, and manual labor at this moment goes to people who are relatively vulnerable and don't have many options. And subsequently, abuse is around the corner. Now, I'm not saying that there's abuse everywhere or that abuse is expected, but there are definite situations here in the wine sector where we know this is a global problem. It's not one particular country or one particular set of countries. There are sophisticated countries there. There are vulnerable countries there. It also means that it's very difficult to point fingers at any particular group of country or any particular situation. We do know that with the situation that we're in now, automation may solve the problem in certain countries, but it won't solve all of the problems in all countries and in all sectors. Manual labor will always be
there. Viveka, please unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, my name is Viveka Anderson. I have a question to Richard as well, and a comment in conjunction with that. And I work with social audits around the world, and quite often, for instance, we can come into a company that produces shoes, for instance, in South Africa or somewhere like that, and they provide shoes to both Adidas, Nike, and a few other labels as well. And each time a company comes in there, they have to actually do another social audit. And we were talking about cost and reducing costs in the supply chain for validating these sort of things. One of the things that is clear is that the UNGP for business does not have a certificate. The OECD does not have a certificate. The ISO 26000 does not actually come with a full certificate, although some companies provide a label that these have been going through. Do you see any changes for something that would provide companies to be able to proactively work as selling towards larger multinationals as well, so that we can reduce the cost of auditing in the supply chain and secure the auditing?
Yeah, the thing is that there are some producers that basically now seem to be having an audit every week.
Yeah.
They have, because there's different, let's say, different sectors. The clothing industry have their own audit firms. The shoe industry used to be part of Amfori. They've now set up their own scheme, and they do this in their own way. And a factory can be audited 3 or 4 different ways. And if they also want to get certain ISO certification, they again have to do that. If they want to be part of 4 Sigma, they have to do. So there's a whole business that now has emerged around certification and all audits. There is a certain part of the auditing group that wants to provide a certificate, and there's a part that does not want to provide a certificate. The ones who do not provide a certificate, basically, and Amfori is part of that school, where you essentially say, well, look, if you do the certificate, then you have to do it every year in order to make sure that a company retains a certain standard. You cannot have a certain situation where you give a company a particular certificate and say you are safe, in order to find out 3 or 4 years later, when you do a repeat audit, that actually they stopped the right behaviors the moment where the auditors left. And that's the disadvantage of the certification schemes, that they give actually in many respects a false security. Second point is that we are very strong proponents of the fact that there should be more business-to-business relationships. So if you are Nike and you buy your products in South Africa, you should just not commission an audit with a third party. You should actually create a relationship with the company that you're buying the shoes from, because only then will you know for sure that the company will try to improve its standards, will continue to improve its standards, and will start slowly to gravitate towards the kind of values that you as a company will bring out. And we in Untitled believe that that's a much stronger tool than actually certification and little certificates.
Okay, I thank you for your input.
Thank you, Viveka, for your question. We're going to take one more question from May Al-Inawi. May, please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. And Richard, thank you for the thought-provoking discussion. There's so many things to ask, but I couldn't help but think of the sublime crisis that led to the financial crisis in 2008, and where, you know, offloading the responsibility and the risk to the different players resulted in a major global financial crisis. So my question to you, and I'm sure the answer is not as simple as something we can tackle in the group, but are we heading to a global ethical crisis, or how can we contribute to solutions so that we can avoid that?
In terms of global commercial thinking, the way that we are now thinking about social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, is only 20 to 15 years old. And a number of companies across the world are now just taking their baby steps. I think, therefore, it's fairly early to say, well, you know, is this going to work? Is this not going to work? Mm-hmm. The discussion on circular economy and circular business models is still in its infancy. There are tools for larger companies, but there are no tools for smaller companies. The issue of risk management and the visualization of risk on the basis of real long-term data, multi-sector, multi-tier, and global, again, that is thinking that is only being developed as we're currently talking. So you may be right that there can be actually, if we don't get this right in the next 10 to 15 years, if we do not have the right systems that deal with this, that spot the ethical dilemmas where they are there, and that make sure that business becomes a major actor in achieving sustainability across the world, yes, by 2040, if we haven't gotten it done, then I think we need to look at the systems. But we're currently building the systems, and the systems are not that old. We're currently building corporate social responsibility programs in most major companies. Those programs are not yet that old. And I always remember, and this may sound like a very strange story, but my father was a businessman. And he had the same ethics and values that I have applied in my entire life. He would never have called himself an ethical businessman, but he made sure that his companies did not pollute. He took good care of the people that worked in his companies. He knew everybody by name. He knew the name of their children. He knew the names of their wives, even if he had a factory of 700 people. There are certain business values that are societal values, that where everybody is part of the same society. All business people are part of this discussion that is going on. They're not impervious to the discussion that is happening on sustainability, on bad business practices, on human rights. So there is a convergence of values going on. But then there are the outliers, in the same way as the outliers of the sort of the financial model led to the crisis. There are outliers, how can I say that, cowboy companies and what have you, that could still prompt a crisis, that could still come up with a number of scandals, some of them because they were cutting corners, and some of them because they just didn't know what they were doing. But by and large, I believe, but that is my personal belief, in the good in people. And there is as much good with people who are working in the corporate sector as there are as good with people who are working in the non-for-profit or in the public sector.
We're getting to the end of time. I think we passed the time a little bit. Just have one comment. When you talk about violations in general, well, I mean, especially human rights. This is not a developing country issue. This is a developed, this is the world issue. I can give you a simple example. When you look at the crop collectors across Europe and North America, when you look at the truck drivers, when you look at the warehouse laborers, they tend to be, in Europe, they tend to be East Europeans. And there have been lots of complaints about Amazon, for example, exploiting labor in their warehouse around Christmas time. Truck drivers, I mean, once you prevent the East Europeans from going to the UK, I mean, nobody's transporting their gasoline. And they've been exploited like hell. Crop in general, crop is collected by somebody somewhere else. I mean, in the US, they tend to get Mexicans, they tend to get illegal immigrants to collect it, and it's all under, so it's everywhere. I mean, and I think it's a problem that we all have to deal with it as humanity.
Absolutely, this is absolutely true. And certain processes that have been set up on human rights due diligence sort of assumed that these human rights due diligence processes would only be utilized in the Southern Hemisphere. I can confirm to you that's no longer the case. There are certain human rights due diligence processes and audits that are conducted in Spain, in Italy, in Australia, because abuse, taking advantage of vulnerable people essentially happens pretty much everywhere. And it's this realization that actually makes companies that are members of Untitled even more vigilant, because they have to look in their own shop, they have to look in their own backyard, and they have to look at the rest of the world. But it is definitely not so that there is a country or a group of countries that have the exclusive problem of human rights abuses. That is not the case.
Richard, I really want to thank you for a very rich discussions, and I don't know what to tell you. I mean, it's been really enlightening. Now, I also thank the audience for attending, and I invite them to join us next Wednesday, October 13th at 7 p.m. The title is going to be Harnessing the Power of African Philanthropy to Fund African Organizations. This is really organized and masterminded by Bridgespan Group, which is a major company, major consulting company for foundations and the third sector in general. We're talking about Jan Schweier, Maddie Holland, and Sia Hey Charters. We have two distinguished guests with them. Tsitsi Masiyawa, she's a major African philanthropist, and she's the chair of the High Life Foundation in Nigeria, and Muson Layode, which is the executive director of the African Philanthropy Forum. I thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Richard, thanks.